Okay, this is Kinesiology 234, and I had a sidebar conversation with somebody who asked me to do a little bit more on types of maxes. And there's a lot to cover in a little bit of time, so I'm going to crank through this. In class, I touched on this. You have three main types, one of which is absolute, the other is training floating, the other is test out. And when you look at these, the absolute is based upon like the parents that you chose, right? If you wanted to have the ability to bench press a ton more weight, then you know what, you probably needed better parents with a better pre-genetic disposition to throw around more weights. And you have to look at like absolute maxes, the absolute ceiling on potential with optimal conditions, optimal training stimuli, optimal rest and recovery cycles. And this would be your genetic potential. And it's a moving target. Understand this, that as you age, your absolute ability to perform sprinting faster, hoisting a bunch of weight, squatting, power cleaning, all those things diminish over time, as I hate to say it myself, but it's part of the process of aging. So your absolute max and your absolute ability to perform, if you will, certain exercises or lifts will in fact diminish. Now, things you can't change are like your anthropometric measurements or somatotype. You can change a little bit, but you can't really change to an extent your fiber type. Now, the training and floating max is really what I tend to spend a lot of my time on, and I tend to focus on with my clients, and also what we'll talk about almost exclusively with this presentation. But it's based upon the daily stressors, right? And you have these stimuli that you place on your body, which are positive stimuli used for training or eliciting a training response, but also you have others that kind of work against you. Family, hate to say it, friends, work, school. These are all things that kind of are negative stressors that can be placed on the body. Your body processes those stressors, right? But with a training floating max itself, it fluctuates, and it fluctuates from workout to workout and week to week. And what you're trying to do is really manipulate that training max to your advantage and to your client's advantage when you're doing programming. With a test out max, often used by coaches, you're trying to guide clients or guide a team of athletes to maybe like a 12-week test out during an off season, and they're going to progress their cycling of the rep and set combinations from maybe 3 sets of 10 to 4 sets of 10 to eights and sixes to sixes and fives. You get the idea, all the way down to where the athletes are testing out and doing sets of 1. But it's usually done over a multi-week progression, and it's sometimes contraindicated for athletes and clients, for that matter, who might be prepubescent, or perhaps they are just, in terms of age, either too young, or if you have older clients, they're too old. And I stress this because when you look at children who play sports in general, their bodies have been subjected to the rigors of that sport. They can run, they can throw, they can catch, tackle, all the above, and they can do so at a pretty high level. So they can handle some of the rigors. And many times coaches get kind of wigged out about having their athletes do a 1-rep max. I personally don't do 1-rep maxes with younger children, prepubescent especially, and even if they are post-pubescent and there are maybe middle high school, I will tend to use a 3-rep max. I'll even use just the actual floating max in general as we go through our workouts, just as a precaution so I don't wreck anybody. All right, if we look ahead at this, the 3 maxes over time. That absolute max is pretty straightforward. This is the total potential that you have, right? And when you're training and you start training early on, there's a big gap between your floating max, what you're able to do today, versus what your absolute max is. The folks who train for the Olympics and do programming over multiple years, maybe even a decade, they're really trying to close this gap, and they get up in here and they're trying to achieve maybe a 0.5% to a 1% performance increase over perhaps an entire training year. Whereas the gap is so big here that any kind of training stimulus you place on the body will elicit a training response. So as you get closer and closer and closer to that absolute max, one must understand that the methods used to achieve a training response have to vary, and they become much different than the ones down here. I oftentimes talk about training for the athlete, the sport, the position, and the person. Very much, when you look at this over a much bigger picture, you're looking at how you're able to get a training max to run up against your test out max, and you're trying to get the test out weight that you want, but also how are you actually able to get this test out in floating max to continually tighten the gap and get closer and closer and closer to the absolute max. And that takes time, it really does. So when we look at what we do in class, keep this graph in mind when we go over these next slides. And there's a couple different formulas here. You know, the Epley one is probably the easiest one to remember, it's just 0.03 per, but there are a number one. Matter of fact, if you were to Google weightlifting max formulas, it'll give you a whole host of them. You can do a Wikipedia. There's a Wikipedia article on it. It's really easy to find. But the simplest is if you go 0.03 per rep, it's really easy to calculate this out. So a person completes 10 reps at 0.03 for the coefficient, that gives you 0.3. 1 minus your coefficient up here gives you 0.7, or also known as 70%. So if a person is pushing a weight around, meaning 140 pounds for a set of 10, you know they were working at about 70% of a 1 rep max. Now there's a range in there, right? You can work with these ranges, and of course if you have a download week, your percentages might be less, and you'll work more of the neural response as opposed to the myo side of the equation, the muscle side. But you gotta understand that that person was probably working at about 70% of a 1 rep max. And that 1 rep max, as I mentioned, floats. So if we take this a step further, you know, you look at it and you go, okay, 0.7 to 70% becomes important because you know that 140 divided by 0.7 is going to give you a 200-pound max. The other way is if you know your 1 rep max and you want to go at 70%, it's 200 pounds times 0.7. If you wanted to do sets of 15, then your number will change and your percentage will change, and your weight that you're going to push around will also be different. It all comes down to basic math, and you'll see this here in a second. So ways to increase this floating max, right? You have two main components. Hey, how many reps that you're doing or completing, and then how much weight is being utilized. And if a person is asked to do a particular weight and they do 5 more pounds or 10 more pounds, you know they got stronger mathematically. If they do a set of 12 and when they were asked to do a set of 10 that you prescribed, you know that they are stronger. And so look at this in terms of the math, right? You do 50 pounds 10 times, and this is just a real simple math here. We'll get into tonnage at one point in this class, but you know the total amount of weight moved is 500 pounds. So really, if you think of this in terms of mathematically, if you do 3 sets of 10 at 50 pounds, it's 1,500 pounds moved. And if you perform 3 sets of 10 at 55 pounds, it's 1,650 pounds moved. So even that supports that you got stronger. The math is there, but the big thing is, if whether you do 1 more rep or a couple more pounds, you know mathematically it flows through, you got stronger. So before this totally blows you out of the water, let's go ahead and pause for 1 second. And this will be loaded up here on Blackboard in just a short bit. We know we're in the orange, so we're good there. So, you know, you look at this, and we talked about these 3 types of maxes, and let's scroll on down a little bit. I put a link in that formula, so you can go ahead and take a look at the wiki article for the Epley formula, and you'll see other ones if you Google that. But the big thing to remember is the 0.03 is the magic coefficient, right? And that 0.03 is actually a little bit of a moving target because, as I mentioned in class, you know, if you have a 1 rep max going on and you get to, and you're performing a 1 rep max, it's actually going to be more like 0.001 or 0.0001, you know, like 90 tenth, hundredth, like maybe 1,000th, if you will, as opposed to 0.03. And the reason why I point that out is when you get into this range, the 3, the 2, the 1, the rep range, you're getting closer and closer and closer to the 1 rep max. And even when you look at doing a set of 1, a set of 1 is in essence a 1 rep max. Now it depends how you kind of lead up to it. If you're going 10, 8, 6, 4, 2, 1 in terms of you're doing a rep scheme for a workout, you've really just done a crap ton of warming up and exhausted yourself leading up to your 1 rep max. Normally with a 1 rep max, you might do a set of 6, a set of 3, a set of 3, maybe then a set of 1 at a really lower percentage, like a 75 to 80%. And then you start going into your maximal attempts. But that's another conversation for another day. And when you look at this, you're going to have a rep range, right? If you do the math on this, 0.03 times 15 gives you 0.45, 0.45 subtracted from 1.0 gives you 0.55, or also known as 55%. So you can kind of figure this out right in here intuitively. But with working out, you'll have a bit of an approximate rep or approximate percentage range you'll work with these different repetitions, right? So if somebody's doing sets of 10, they might be anywhere between 65 and 70%. Or if they're doing sets of 4, they might be anywhere between 85 and 90%. And if you're in a download week, maybe like where you're backing off the amount of weight that needs to be pushed, but you're going to keep the rep range the same, you're going to back this out by about 20%. So 70 becomes 50, 75 becomes 55. You get the idea. But the idea is you're taking the loading parameters and backing those down while continuing to work in the same rep range, so the body continues to understand what it's like to fire 3 off or 4 off or 2 off, but you're taking a little bit of load off the muscles. The other side of this is when you're in a higher volume type program, you would probably look towards backing off some of the volume overall by reducing the number of sets. So instead of 3 sets of 15, you might have 1 set of 15, or instead of 4 sets of 12, you might have 2 sets of 12, just to back down the entire the overall volume scheme, if you will. So I brought this up and I wrote this out in that PowerPoint presentation. It's over here to read through as well if it helps. Also, I broke this out. Maybe this will help you as well. So if you look at this and you go, all right, if a person adds 5 pounds to the workout and they do 10 reps, we know the coefficient is this. We know the calculated coefficient is that. And we know the 1 rep max is actually going to be 0.7. 1 minus 0.3 gives us 0.7 or 70%. And so the max is 207 pounds. If we add 1 rep, so instead of 10, they do 11, and we know it's 0.03. 0.03 times 11 gives us 0.33, and now they're actually working at a 67% of a 1 rep max. It's about 209 pounds, give or take. So it's kind of in the same ballpark, but the end result is what you see is the floating max changes. And it gets kind of hairy here, guys, and this is where it gets kind of funky, but you can start doing the math on this, right? You know, if you have somebody who's supposed to do, they have a 200-pound max and they just do straight through sets of 10, sets of 8, sets of 6 over maybe week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, week 5, 6, 7, and 8. If they don't do anything at all to the max, they're going to end up with a 200-pound max. And when you look at this and you go, okay, instead of doing 140, they do 145, that person's floating max just went up to 207. Now you base the next workout 70% off of 207, the workout now becomes 145. So they do their 145s, that's great. The max is still 207. The next time they come in, week number 3, they're doing 75% of their floating max, which is based off of 207. Now they're pushing 155 instead of 150. And now you go, all right, so that's my workout weight, but they end up using 160. Their max goes up to 213. You get the idea. It flows through in the floating max. Now, granted, this is kind of an aggressive rep scheme, and it was done for the sake of being able to get this point across. You know, you might smooth this out a little bit where it would be, sets of 8 and 10, or 10 and 8, then sets of 8, then sets of 8 and 6, then sets of 6, sets of 6 and 5, then sets of 5, and you would break that out over a much smoother transition. But I wanted to get this point across because this would be a pretty aggressive strength gain. But my point is this: if you're able to add a couple pounds to each workout while you're working out, this number, the floating max, is going to go up. And if we go back to the visual in here, in the floating max, towards a test out max, what you're doing is you're driving that athlete towards a higher test out weight because you're increasing the loading parameters for them based off of their own performance. Their body is adapting to the increased behind the scenes floating max that's going on. Same thing, I only got another minute and a half left, but if you look at this and you go, okay, instead of doing 10, I do 11, instead of 8, I do 9. We have a couple weeks where they're banging out and they're staying with the same rep scheme, but at the very end, instead of doing 5, they do 6. You can see the coefficient, what calculates out to the 1 rep max, and you can see how the actual floating max goes up over that time, almost in a commensurate step, whether it's 5 pounds each time or it's 1 rep every couple of weeks. The idea is if you can get an athlete or your client to eke out 1 more rep or push just a little more weight, you have made demonstrative change and can show them mathematically that they got stronger. And many times it's just as simple as, instead of picking up a 45-pound bar, they do a 50-pound bar, or a 60-pound dumbbell instead of the 35-pound dumbbell at the very beginning when they first started working out several weeks ago. But again, guys, I want to get across to you this: you can show this demonstratively to your clients. You can say, look how much you've gotten stronger. You started off benching 200 pounds and now you're at 224. It is just as simple as showing the math. All right, guys, I'm going to punch out on this one. Hope everybody's having a good one, and I will see you later. Bye.